My brother Derek inherited the lake house on Poplar Ridge with its wraparound porch, its boat dock, and 3 acres of cleared land valued at just under $900,000. I inherited the collapsed barn at the edge of grandfather's property that had not seen a working roof since the Clinton administration. When Mr. Oakes, the family attorney, finished reading those words in his quiet office on the edge of downtown Nashville, Derek did not bother to hide his smile. He leaned back in his chair and looked at me the way people look at something they feel sorry for but do not intend to help. Sasha, his wife, touched her pearl necklace and tilted her head to the side with an expression she probably thought looked like sympathy. It looked like theater. Grandfather had also left Derek the savings account, the truck, and the mineral rights to 40 acres of bottomland that a gas company had been circling for 2 years. I got a barn with no floor, no electricity, and a deed that listed the structure as agriculturally non-operational. I did not know what that meant, but the lawyer's voice got quieter when he said it, which told me enough. "There's also a personal note," Mr. Oakes said, sliding an envelope across the desk toward me. "Your grandfather asked that you read it privately." Derek reached over and plucked the envelope from my fingers before I could touch it. He held it up to the light, squinting, as if he could read the words through the paper. Then he set it back down, not in front of me, but in the middle of the table, like it was communal property. "Daddy always did love the dramatics," he said. Sasha laughed, a small practiced laugh that meant she agreed with whatever Derek said. "I am Claire Whitmore. I am 30 years old. I have been teaching music at a middle school in Murfreesboro for 6 years, and I am the kind of person who irons her clothes the night before and keeps a gratitude journal that she has not written in since April. I am not dramatic. I am not confrontational. I have spent most of my adult life being the quiet one, the reasonable one, the one who brings the potato salad to family gatherings and does not complain when someone else takes the seat she was saving." But when Derek slid that envelope back to me and said, with genuine pity in his voice, that I could have the barn assessed for scrap value, something shifted in my chest. It was not anger exactly. It was something colder and quieter than anger. It was clarity. I took the envelope and put it in my bag without opening it. I thanked Mr. Oakes for his time. I told Derek and Sasha to enjoy their evening, and then I walked out of that office into the August heat and sat in my car in the parking garage for 11 minutes, breathing slowly, thinking about the last time I had seen my grandfather alive. He had been in the hospital by then, oxygen tubes and monitors and a television playing the Weather Channel on mute, but his eyes were sharp. They were always sharp, even at the end. He had taken my hand and held it with a grip that surprised me for a man that thin, and he said, "Clary, you're the only one who ever listened." I had thought he meant to his stories. I had thought he meant the way I used to sit with him on the porch when I was small, not saying anything, just listening to him pick out old songs on whatever guitar happened to be near his chair. I did not understand yet what he actually meant, but I was about to. The Whitmore property in Crossroads sat at the end of a gravel road that turned to mud whenever it rained, which in Tennessee in August meant about 4 days out of 7. The farmhouse where my grandfather had lived for 60 years was already Derek's by the time I drove out the following morning. He had called a property management company before the ink on the will was dry. There was a lockbox on the door and a sign in the window from a Nashville real estate group. He worked fast when he wanted something. The barn was a quarter-mile past the house, past the old garden that had gone to weeds, past the fence line where grandfather used to feed apples to a horse that had been dead for 15 years. I could see it from the road before I turned in, which was not encouraging. The structure sagged on its north side where one of the corner posts had rotted through. The tin roof had peeled back in one section, curling up like a page in a book left out in the weather. The wood was silver gray, the color of old things that have given up pretending to be new. I parked in the grass and sat for a moment. My total savings were $4,200. I had a full tank of gas and half a tank of grief and no idea what I was going to do with a building that looked like it was trying to lie down. I got out of the car. The barn had 2 main doors, sliding doors on a rusted rail that ground against itself when I pushed. The smell that came out was dry and dark, old wood and something mineral beneath it, like stone or deep earth. I had brought a flashlight even though it was mid-morning because I had seen enough of the roof from the outside to know there would be dark places in there. The floor was dirt and scattered straw in the main section, the stalls empty, the hooks on the walls bare except for one coil of rope so old it had petrified in its loops. I walked the perimeter slowly, shining my light into the corners. A workbench ran along the back wall, longer than I expected, maybe 20 feet, and above it hung a pegboard with the outlines of tools drawn in faded marker, the way people mark where things go so they can find them later. But the tools were gone. Every outline had a ghost and nothing else. I stood in front of that pegboard for a long time. Grandfather Ray had worked with his hands his entire life. He built cabinets, repaired cars, raised 2 children, and fixed whatever broke for anyone in a 20-mile radius who asked. He was the kind of man who could look at something broken and understand it, but he had never talked about what he did in this barn. Not once. The barn had always been locked when I was a child, and I had never asked why. The same way children accept the locked doors in houses without question because the adult world has so many of them. I noticed the floor. It was wrong. Not all of it, just a section in the back corner behind the workbench, roughly 8 feet by 6 feet, where the dirt was darker and more compacted than the rest. The surrounding floor was loose and dry, the kind of dirt that shifts under your shoe, but this section was hard and smooth, the way earth gets when something heavy has rested on it for a long time. And at the edge of it, half buried, was a metal ring set into a wooden panel flush with the ground. I crouched down and pulled. The panel was heavy. My fingers slipped the first time and I had to grip the ring with both hands and lean back, using my weight. It came up with a sound like a seal breaking, a soft exhalation of air that smelled nothing like the barn above it. The air that came up was cool and controlled and carried the faint scent of cedar and lemon oil. The ladder bolted to the wall of the opening was wooden but solid. I went down slowly, testing each rung. My flashlight swept the space below, and then I stopped moving entirely because what I was looking at did not make sense in the context of what I had just climbed down from. The room was roughly 30 feet long and 15 wide. The walls were lined with cedar planking, smooth and fitted, the work of someone who cared about getting it right. Along the left wall ran a series of built-in racks, floor to ceiling, each rack padded with foam and felt, and in those racks were guitars. Dozens of them, some in cases, some hanging open to the air, their bodies gleaming softly under the low-wattage bulbs that hung on a wire from the ceiling and were still burning. The power was on, had been on for who knows how long. I turned around slowly. The right wall held a different kind of storage, shallow drawers labeled in my grandfather's handwriting, a workbench with luthier's tools laid out with the precision of a surgeon's tray, and on a wooden stand in the far corner, elevated slightly as if set apart from the rest, was a guitar unlike anything I had seen outside of a museum photograph. I knew what it was before I crossed the room to look at it, the same way you sometimes know a word before you can define it. The body was small and rounded, Brazilian rosewood so dark it was almost black, the spruce top worn to a honey color by decades of playing. The headstock was plain and unadorned. On the inside of the sound hole, visible through the worn finish, was a paper label. I crouched low and angled my light. Martin & Co., Nazareth, Pennsylvania. 1936. I sat down on the floor of my grandfather's secret room and pressed my hands flat against the cool concrete and tried to remember how to breathe. I was a music teacher. I had studied stringed instruments in college. I knew enough to understand that a 1936 Martin in this condition, with whatever provenance story was attached to it, was not a barn find. It was a revelation. It was the kind of thing that changed the architecture of a life. I did not touch it. Not yet. I walked the room instead, reading the labels on the drawers, opening the cases, leaning against the base of the racks. A 1941 Gibson J45, a 1959 Fender Telecaster, sunburst, not a mark on the body. A Collings mandolin with a handwritten note taped inside the case that read, Eddie's, keep it safe. Pre-war flat tops, arch tops, a banjo with mother-of-pearl inlay that caught my light and threw it back in fragments. On the workbench was a leather journal. The cover was cracked, and the binding was soft with age, and when I opened it, my grandfather's handwriting filled the pages in blue ink, dense and careful. I sat on a wooden stool and I read. He had started collecting in 1968, the year a man named Calvin Reese came to his door with a guitar in a pillowcase and asked if grandfather would buy it. Calvin's wife was sick. The hospital bill was already more than he had. The guitar had belonged to Calvin's father, who had played session work in Memphis in the 30s and 40s, working with musicians whose names I recognized from the music history classes I taught. Calvin did not want to sell it. He sat in Grandfather's kitchen and held the case on his lap like something living. Grandfather paid him 3 times what the dealer in Nashville had offered. He wrote in the journal that he told Calvin the guitar would be there whenever he wanted to visit it. Calvin came back 11 times over the next 20 years, the journal said. He never asked to take it back, but he would sit with it for an hour and then go home. That was the Martin. The rest of the collection had come the same way. Over 50 years of Grandfather seeing things clearly when no one else did, of paying fair prices when the world was offering insults, of promising to keep things safe when the system was designed to scatter them. He had not collected out of greed or vanity or the desire to own rare things. He had collected because people brought him their irreplaceable objects at the worst moments of their lives, and he had chosen, every time, to be the place those things could rest. I closed the journal. I looked at the room around me. I thought about Derek sliding that envelope to the middle of the table like it was something to be shared, like my grandfather's private words to me were a resource to be managed. I thought about the developer Derek had mentioned, casually, over lunch 2 days ago, the one who wanted to turn the Whitmore property into a subdivision of vacation homes. I had not been invited to that lunch. I heard about it from a cousin. Derek had already taken the meeting. I went back up the ladder and pulled the hatch closed behind me. I drove to the nearest town, which took 20 minutes and had 1 gas station and a hardware store. I bought a new padlock for the barn doors, a deadbolt for the hatch, and 4 bottles of water. I sat in the parking lot of the hardware store and called the only person I trusted enough to call. Her name was Ruth, and she had been my closest friend since college, and she was also, as of 3 years ago, a practicing attorney in Nashville with a reputation for taking cases that other people called unprofitable and winning them so decisively that the other side was still confused about what happened 6 months later. "Tell me everything," she said. I did. There was a pause on her end that lasted long enough for me to get worried. Then she said, "Do not touch anything in that room. Do not tell anyone what you found. Do not let Derek onto that property. And drive to my office right now." Ruth's office was on the 7th floor of a building downtown that smelled of coffee and industrial carpet. She had family photos on her desk and a plant she kept forgetting to water and a legal mind that I had watched dismantle grown men who thought they were untouchable. She spent an hour on the phone while I sat in her visitor's chair and watched the city out the window. She called an appraiser she knew in New York. She called a specialist at Vanderbilt who taught American music history. She called a friend at Christie's. "The 1936 Martin," she said when she hung up. "If it's what you're describing, with the provenance story and the condition, could start at $300,000 at auction and go significantly higher. The collection as a whole, depending on specifics, could be anywhere from $4 to $10 million. She let that sit. "Derek does not know it exists." "No," I said. "He never came out here as a kid. He thought the barn was for storage." "Good," Ruth said. "We need to move carefully. I'm going to file the probate documentation to establish clear ownership of all contents within the barn structure. The deed transfers the building and everything in it. Once that's recorded, Derek can't claim the instruments are separate from the property." I nodded. I was still hearing the number. $4 to $10 million. My grandfather, who drove a truck with a cracked dashboard and wore the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation and brought grocery bags back from the store to use as trash can liners, had been sitting on something worth $10 million. And he had chosen to give it to the music teacher, the quiet one, the one who listened. The process server arrived at the barn on a Tuesday morning. I was inside at the workbench making an inventory list from the journal when I heard a car on the gravel. I climbed up the ladder and met the man at the door. He had an envelope and an apologetic expression. The motion was filed by Derek Whitmore through a Nashville law firm, alleging that the barn and its contents belonged to the broader estate and should be divided equally, and furthermore, that our grandfather had shown signs of cognitive decline in the months before his death that called into question the validity of the will. It was not true. I had been with grandfather every week for the last 2 years of his life. His mind was the last thing to go. He knew exactly what he was doing. But Derek had money and a lawyer in a building with a chandelier in the lobby, and I had $4,000 and a padlock on a barn door. I called Ruth. She said, "Good. Now we have a reason to get a court order for a formal appraisal, which means we establish the collection's value on record before Derek can claim there's nothing here worth fighting over." She paused. "Did your grandfather ever record himself? Video, audio, anything?" I thought of the hospital room. I thought of the nurses who had set up an iPad for him so he could watch baseball. I thought of how, 2 weeks before the end, he had asked me to sit beside him and he had talked for almost an hour about the barn, about each instrument, about Calvin Reese and the Martin guitar. He had been speaking quietly and carefully, like a man who knew he was making a record. I had recorded it on my phone without telling him, because I wanted to keep his voice. I had not listened to it since he died. I drove to Ruth's office with my phone. We listened together in her conference room. My grandfather's voice filled the room, steady and clear, describing the collection in detail, its origins, its contents, the names and stories attached to every significant piece. He named the instruments. He gave dates. He described the 1,936 Martin and Calvin Reese with a specificity that no one in the grip of cognitive decline could produce. Ruth looked at me when it was over. "This is everything," she said. "This is the whole case." Things moved quickly after that, and also very slowly, the way legal things do. Fast in the moments that matter, and then stretched to nothing in the waiting. The court ordered a formal inventory and appraisal, which meant a specialist coming to the barn with cameras and gloves and a clipboard and spending 2 days cataloging every instrument while I watched from the corner and tried not to hover. His name was Thomas Vance, and he had done appraisals for Sotheby's for 20 years. And when he got to the Martin and picked it up and turned it over in his hands, he sat down in the chair beside the workbench and did not speak for almost a minute. "I want to pull the serial number," he said finally. We did. We cross-referenced it with Martin's factory records that afternoon. The guitar had been built in February of 1936 and sold to a distributor in Memphis. The serial number matched a guitar that appeared in 3 session photographs from 1938, held by a musician whose recordings were still in print and still being studied. The provenance was not a story, it was a documented fact. Thomas Vance filed his formal appraisal with the court 2 weeks later. Total collection value: $7,400,000. The 1,936 Martin alone was listed at $450,000 as a conservative floor, with a note that competitive auction could push it considerably higher. Derek found out on a Thursday. I know this because he called me that evening, and his voice had changed. The smoothness was gone. What was underneath it was not what I expected. It was not rage. It was something smaller and more frightened. "We should talk," he said. "I agree," I said. He wanted to meet at a restaurant downtown, neutral ground, a place with good lighting and no history. I said I would rather meet at the barn. He said that seemed unnecessary. I said then we could talk through our attorneys. He agreed to the barn. He came on a Saturday morning with Sasha and without his lawyer, which told me he had not told his lawyer he was coming. Sasha was wearing a jacket that cost more than my monthly rent, and she held her coffee cup with both hands, as if the temperature outside was something happening to her personally. I met them at the door. I did not invite them inside. "The appraisal is public record," Derek said. He was looking past me at the barn. I didn't know. "I know you didn't," I said. "Dad never told me." He said it quietly, and I heard something in it that was almost genuine, a flicker of the brother I had grown up with before he decided that money was the most important language. He could have told us both. He could have just divided it equally. Why would he hide it from me? I looked at him for a moment. The morning was warm and the field behind the barn was high with grass, and the light was the kind of particular August light that makes everything look like it is about to end or about to begin. "He didn't hide it from you," I said. "He left it to me. There's a difference." Derek's jaw tightened. "We can settle this without going back to court. I'll drop the challenge. But I want something." "I know you do," I said. "Your lawyer can call Ruth." I went back inside and closed the door. The challenge was dropped the following Monday. The legal clarity that followed felt like a window opening in a room that had been shut for a long time. The summer moved toward fall. The appraisal was public. The local paper ran a small story about the collection, the phrase hidden treasure appeared in the headline, and then a music publication in Nashville ran a longer piece, and then it stopped being local. A journalist from a national outlet called Ruth's office. A documentary producer called twice. The Martin guitar and the story behind it, Calvin Reese and his father's life in Memphis and my grandfather's quiet 50-year act of preservation, reached the kind of people who understood what it meant. The real work was not the press. The real work was figuring out what to do next. I thought about selling. I will not pretend I did not think about it. $7 million is a very specific kind of freedom when you are 30 years old and have been eating generic peanut butter for most of the decade. But every time I thought about the drawers in that room with their careful labels and Calvin Reese coming back 11 times over 20 years just to sit with something that had belonged to his father, I knew that dispersing the collection to private buyers was not what it had been kept for. It was not what I had been given it for. I called a meeting with Ruth and Thomas Vance and a woman named Dr. Patricia Leach, who taught American roots music at Vanderbilt and had driven out to the barn twice already, just to stand in the room and look at what was there. We sat around the workbench in the underground room and talked for 4 hours. By the end of it, we had the outline of something. A museum was too static. A sale was too final. What we were building was something in between, a living collection with a purpose, where the instruments could be studied and played by people who were learning, where the stories attached to them could be told and preserved alongside the objects themselves, a center. The kind of place where a student from a small town could come and sit with a 1936 Martin and understand that the object in front of them was not just wood and wire but an argument against forgetting. I sold 3 instruments to private collectors, pieces that had no strong provenance stories, workmanlike guitars from the middle of the collection that were valuable but not irreplaceable. The sale brought in just under $900,000. I used it to build a proper foundation, climate-controlled storage, restoration of the barn structure, and the beginning of a small endowment. The center opened on a Saturday in October. I did not rent a venue. We opened here, at the barn, which was no longer a barn in the way that a library is no longer just a building with books in it. The roof was repaired. The floor was poured. The underground room had proper lighting and ventilation, and a series of display cases that Thomas had helped design. The Martin sat in a case at the center, illuminated from above, with a placard that began with Calvin Reese's name. People came from Nashville and Memphis, and further. Music teachers and luthiers and historians, and a woman who had driven from Mississippi because she had read the article about her grandfather's mandolin, which she had not known still existed, which was one of the instruments in the second rack on the left wall. She stood in front of the case for a long time. I did not interrupt her. Derek came. I had not invited him, but the opening was public, and he showed up alone, without Sasha, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt I recognized from years ago. He stood in the back of the room during the brief remarks I made, and when I finished, he did not clap the way the others did, but he also did not leave. He walked slowly through the collection, reading each placard, stopping in front of the Martin for longer than I expected. I did not approach him, but after most of the crowd had moved outside to the tables we had set up in the field, he found me near the entrance. He built something real, Derek said. He was looking at the space, not at me. I always thought this place was nothing. I know, I said. He looked at me then. I'm sorry for the stunt with the will contest, and for he started again. For the lunch meeting with the developer, I had already agreed to sell before he was in the ground. That was wrong. I had thought a lot about what I would say if this moment came. I had rehearsed several versions of it, some of them generous and some of them not. What came out was simpler than any of them. I know it was wrong, I said. But you're here now, and this is still standing, and that's what matters to me. He nodded. He went outside. I did not watch him go. Later that evening, after the crowd was gone, and the tables were folded and the underground room was locked and the lights were off except for the security lamp above the door, I sat on the front step of the barn with a cup of tea that had gone cold and looked out at the field. The grass was silver in the early moonlight. The air smelled of cedar and turned earth and the faint sweetness of something I could not name. I had spent so much of my life being the quiet one, the one who did not demand, who waited and absorbed and brought the potato salad and went home alone. I had been raised in the same family as my brother, but we had learned entirely different lessons from it. He had learned that the visible things were the valuable things: the house with the view, the truck, the account balance, the number on the appraisal. I had learned something else from my grandfather without knowing it was a lesson. I had learned to listen. And listening, it turned out, was how you found what was underneath. The center was not finished. It would not be finished for a long time. There was work to do with the provenance research, with the grant applications, with the school partnerships Dr. Leach was building at Vanderbilt. There was a waiting list of scholars who wanted access to the collection and a waiting list of luthiers who wanted to study the construction of the instruments grandfather had built himself, the ones he had not bought from anyone, but made by hand in this room over decades of quiet winter evenings. There was a 15-year-old girl from a town 40 minutes away who had emailed me after reading the article in the music publication. She played guitar. She had no money for lessons, and her school had cut the music program 2 years ago. I had written back and told her to come on a Tuesday, any Tuesday, and I would be there. She came the following week. She was small and serious with her guitar in a case held together with duct tape, and she stood in the underground room and looked at the instruments the way I had looked at them the first time, like she was trying to understand a language she had not known existed but somehow already recognized. I put a chair across from mine and sat down and asked her to play me something, anything she knew. She played a song I had not heard before, something she said she had written herself. 3 chords and a melody that was raw and true and imperfect in the way that real things are imperfect, and when she finished, she looked up at me as if she was waiting for the verdict. I thought of my grandfather in the hospital. I thought of him holding my hand. I thought of him saying, "You're the only one who ever listened. Play it again," I said. "But slower this time. Let the chord ring out fully before you move." She nodded. She played it again. In the space around us, in the cedar-lined walls and the felt-padded racks, and the case where the 1936 Martin rested in its particular darkness, something settled. The way things settle when they have found where they belong. I did not think about Derek or about the legal fees or about the $4,200 that was all I had when I first opened the hatch. I did not think about the number on the appraisal or the documentary producer who was still waiting for a callback or the developer who had moved on to some other property and some other family's inheritance. I thought about structure, about how the things that last are not the shiniest ones, not the ones that catch light from the outside, but the ones that are built correctly from the inside out, the ones that are meant to hold something precious long after the person who built them is gone. My grandfather had poured his foundation deep. He had reinforced it with 50 years of showing up for people when they had nothing left to sell but the things they loved most. I was his daughter's daughter. I was the keeper of what he kept. And I was just getting started.